I didn't fall gracefully. It didn't even register in my mind that I should be at least attempting to break my fall. I landed on my back about 20 feet away from where I'd been standing. I let out a wheezing grunt as the air knocked out of my lungs by the impact. I lay there for a moment trying to register what just happened and just plain old trying to catch my breath. I looked over at Doc and the woman. She was holding him by the front of his blouse. She lifted him off the ground. Doc may have been a pacifist, but he got the idea that he wasn't in a position to not fight back. His booted feet kicked at her, but he just couldn't seem to nail her a good one. He balled up his fist and sent wild haymakers at her. I know he made contact with the side of her head, but it didn't seem to bother her. I pushed myself to my feet, still trying to pull the air into my lungs. I staggered forward in unsteady feet and managed to close the distance whilst Doc fought for his life. I brought up my M4, reared back and shoved the rifle forward, intending to muzzle thump her in the ribs, because for some reason that seemed like a good idea at the time. Without looking, her free hand shot out and grabbed the rifle of my barrel, stopping my half-assed clumsy charge dead in its tracks. I reacted on muscle memory alone. My thumb clicked the selector off safe mode and onto fire. I popped 2 rounds before she pulled the rifle from my grip. She jammed the rifle backwards, the butt stock catching me in the chest, knocking the breath out of me again. I fell flat on my ass again. My lungs burned for air. My ears were ringing from the rifle fire. She turned and hurled the weapon off into the desert somewhere. End over end, the rifle sailed off into the night sky, out into the darkness. She smiled down at me. Her not quite right eyes were packed with malicious glee. She threw her head back and laughed. I noticed that there was blood trickling down her arm. At least one of my shots had hit her. The shoulder of her t-shirt was soaked in blood. It didn't seem to matter to her, though. She smiled at me again and shook her head, like one would do at the antics of a particularly stupid raccoon. She turned her gaze back to Doc, who was still struggling at the end of her outreached arm. Doc never quit. He was still kicking, still swinging. My friend fought as best he could. Like the gunshot shoulder, it just didn't seem to matter to the woman. Her jaw dropped open, her rotten teeth were on full display. I noticed that her eyes rolled into the back of her head till just the whites were showing, like a shark that was going in for the kill. She made a sound deep in her throat, quietly dry heaving like she was trying to make herself puke. She sat like that for a moment, Doc struggling out on the end of her arm, her jaw hanging open. Then the grossest fucking thing I've ever seen happened. Something white poked out past her teeth. It should have been hard to see, with nothing but the moonlight to aid the eye, but the thing was a shade of bone white that seemed to damn near glow in the dark. It was a little bulbous thing, and as it crawled out of her mouth and down her cheek, I groaned out loud as revulsion washed over me. It hopped onto her shoulder and began poking its way up her arm, towards Doc's face. I realized it was an oversized maggot, about the size of a .50 cal round. It was heading right for Doc. Doc saw it coming too. Both of his eyes went wide as he watched it march up the woman's extended arm towards him. Somehow we both knew it was heading for his mouth. He clamped his mouth shut as hard as he could. He tried to slap the maggot, but, like the woman, the bug wasn't too worried about Doc's efforts at self-defense. As it got closer, I heard muffled screaming, as Doc did his best to keep his mouth closed. He was terrified. I was too. The woman reached out with her free hand, her fingers slightly caressing Doc's face. He tried to jerk his head away from the woman's dirty hand, but it didn't work. He just couldn't shake her. Doc's mouth opened. I don't know if it was to scream or to tell the woman to fuck off. I prefer to think it was the latter, but it didn't matter. He never got the chance. The huge maggot at this point was on the woman's hand, or it was before it jumped into Doc's mouth. It wiggled past his lips and back behind his teeth. Doc's eyes went wide. He made choking sounds as the thing slithered down his gullet. The woman ran her free hand across his temple like a mother trying to comfort her child. Doc looked back down at her, his eyes wide in terror. She merely smiled back up at him again before her jaw fell back open. More maggot heads poked out past her lips. If I thought one was bad, the torrent of maggots spilling from her lips was worse. They were following in their fellow bug's footprints, out of her mouth, inching across her face, down her neck, across her shoulder. They quickly covered her arm in a wiggling mass of disgust and ugly. They followed the path up her arm towards Doc's face. Doc's eyes were still wide open, still terrified, but that thing that was inside of him must have done something to him, because he relaxed in her grip, like all the fighting was just drained right out of him. His mouth fell open as if he was welcoming the maggots into him. I figured I had to do something, so I pushed myself to my feet. I noticed that I was rasping a little as I staggered forward. By this point, her arm was completely covered in maggots. They're almost to Doc's face. I reached down deep and grabbed a hold of whatever fight I still had left in me, what hadn't been battered out of me at that point. I took a few loping, jittery steps and did my best to barrel towards the woman, hoping to knock her over and interrupt the maggot transfer. I threw myself forward, trying to truck her ass. It was like hitting a fence post dug 20 feet into solid concrete. My mass hitting hers had zero effect. I fell to the ground at her feet just as the maggot parade marched into Doc's mouth. My bell was severely rung and the woman didn't even react. Didn't even acknowledge my existence. I tasted blood in my mouth and wasn't sure where it had come from. Holy fuck. I managed to rasp out as the pain dug its nails into me. Doc started to convulse. I desperately hoped for the cavalry to hurry up and arrive because I clearly wasn't cutting the mustard. I could hear the sound of a roaring AAV in the distance. I could tell from the tone of the engine that it wasn't coming quickly, probably plodding along with a ground guide in front of it for safety's sake. Whereas me and Doc had just walked down the side of the hill. The track would have had to take a tank trail, especially out with the old trenches and fighting holes everywhere. Dingo was probably playing it safe with the tractor. He probably felt that whatever the situation was, I would have it in hand. You would have thought the earlier rifle fire would have lit a bit of a fire under their asses. I looked up at Doc as the last of the maggots wriggled past his lips. His eyes dropped closed. His body stopped shaking. Frothy drool spilled from the edges of his mouth. Something big was happening to him. I remember praying that he wasn't dead. I regret that prayer now. Doc's eyes popped back open. His face was blank for a moment, before his features slid into a smile that was similar to the woman's. Malicious as all fuck, with a certain sort of dangerous evil dancing behind his eyes. A look that never once in his 23 years on this earth ever graced his features. His eyes weren't quite right. She grinned up at him. He closed his eyes and nodded back down at her with a small, tight-lipped smile of his own on his face. She lowered him to his feet. Whatever had happened seemed to be done. I remember looking up at him. The way he stood, the way he faced me, the way he looked, the way his right hand jittered with a nervous energy. That ain't Doc, I remember thinking. They both looked down at me in unison as if joined in thought.
This one?
The woman asked out loud. Not this one, Doc said. His voice was the same, yet somehow different, like someone else was working his voice box.
This one's end?
The woman asked out loud again. The hairs on my neck stood up at the cryptic bullshit. There were only so many things a sentence like that could mean. Doc stared down at me for a moment. I saw something flash across his eyes, a moment of softness. Maybe it was Doc still rattling around in there, exerting some influence. Maybe the thing in Doc just didn't think I was the right size of a meat suit. I don't know. No, Doc finally said. Amusement this one might yet make. The woman's eyes got wide. She threw her head back and laughed. Doc laughed with her. Harsh barks of laughter, big old guffaws like Doc had told the ultimate giggler. I looked from one to the other. I was sporting a big old ball of anxiety in my chest and was wondering just how concerned I should be about all of this laughing. What with an open and frank discussion of my end going on. I could hear the AAV gaining ground on us. I would have turned my head to look, but honestly, I didn't want to take my eyes off the thing staring over me. Doc and the woman both looked at each other, into each other's eyes. Both nodded at each other as one, something unspoken passing between them. With that unsaid, unknown something, they turned on their heels and ran off into the desert, moving a lot quicker than either of them physically should have been able to. The night quickly shrouded them from view. I watched after them, the direction they went, until they were out of sight. I didn't know what just happened. I didn't know, but I felt as if I'd just lost my friend. Like I should be mourning. Doc was dead. It was just a different kind of dead. I didn't move. I sat right there on my ass to figure out what had just happened. I realized I was shaking and it had nothing to do with the chilly night air. It was only a matter of time before the ground guide from the AV coming out to pick us up reached me, dragging the giant troop hauler along behind him. And I sat there, ignoring the Marine asking me if I was okay, asking where Doc was. I didn't even look up at him. Couldn't admit I'd just let my friend down. I stared up into the headlights of the AV. I remember them seeming to look like an angry god's eyes glaring down at me, like I'd failed. And to be fair, I had. I hadn't been able to save Doc.